I'm Verity Babs and welcome to Art Laughs. Today I spoke to Alex Farrow.
Hello, my name is Alex Farrow. Oh, am I going to answer why am I? Oh, please don't. It's hard enough. I teach a bit of philosophy, and I've become known for doing horrendously pretentiously named shows like Philosophy A-Level and stuff like that. Shows being of a comedic sort. I run a stand-up club. I run Jericho Comedy. I teach in a school. That's me. I've decided to define myself via my work. I'm a deep product of the capitalist system, clearly.
Aren't we all?
Listening to the album that comes with this artwork reminded me just how first came across alternative goth metal and punk as a teenager, and it was really wrapped up with the idea that one day I was gonna bring down capitalism, and who would have thought that it would just do that itself? Absolutely no help needed from me.
Let's introduce the album cover. So you've picked Bauhaus's Bela Lugosi's Dead. You sort of already hinted at this kind of being a kind of adolescent favourite, but yeah, why don't you run me through why you picked this piece?
Struggling to pick where to start. I just like the aesthetic of it. I like any art piece where you gain much more, like the more you look at it. I remember listening to the music as a teenager. I remember really being into that kind of goth alternative metal vibe. I used to be into other bands like Placebo. Now I just think I was into the idea of bands like Placebo. It was more about the aesthetic rather than perhaps the actual sounds themselves. So the look and the art of it as much as the music. But with this particular art piece, I remember the first time I saw it, I thought, that's. I remember thinking it was like a female vampire, and listening to this absurdly long 9-minute track. You end up looking at the album art, and you're like, no, it's not. It's something else going on in there, and you sort of get kind of more from it the more you look at it. It's and I only found out, a year or two later, that it's actually this chap. Obviously, it's Bela Lugosi, and it's a man, and he's in the shadow of Satan. And the closer you look, the more he's kind of obviously reaching for the door. I love any artwork that makes you sort of change your perspective like that. The more you look at it, the more you get a shift. You're like, that's different to what I thought.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really draws me to the Gothic aesthetic, that taking of something that should be dark, should be bad, should be evil, should be ugly, and making it beautiful. That kind of aesthetic shift, I think it's incredible. I think it's one of the best things that any piece of art can do.
Yeah, I mean, looking at this, it's quite Rorschach test-esque, because when you look at it, you're like, okay, we're getting that. And then, like you say, when you realise that Bela Lugosi famously played Dracula, and talking about the aesthetic of things as well, Bauhaus is a band who have named themselves after a school of art and design from 1919. Apparently they were originally called Bauhaus 1919, and then they were too wordy, get rid of it. And so yeah, this album cover in itself is loaded with a lot of clues about aesthetic and about the importance of the visual. I like what you say about listening to it and then looking back at the album artwork and getting more from the album artwork having seen it. And I suppose that nowadays with things like Spotify, when you're listening to a song, the album cover is always there. But I don't know whether I've ever specifically looked at the album cover while listening to see if I'm getting anything else out of it. And I don't know whether that's because more often than not you're listening to an album rather than a single and things like that. How has your music intake and the way you listen to music changed?
I listen to a lot of, I think like all of us, right? We listen to it via some form of stream now. There are times I'll make a conscious effort to go back to an album format with a piece of physical artwork with it. It's a lost form of expression in some ways. I remember as a teenager, mostly with CDs, right? I say right as though you probably had CDs as well. We might be too different.
Just about. I'm at the end. I was at the end of CDs. The end of CDs.
Oh, man. Yeah. So I remember it being you'd listen to the music and you'd have this whole like fold out. It'd be like a full on like broadsheet. And there were different ways to do it, and you'd often have like the hidden track, right, which is another sort of lost thing. So you won't know about the hidden track, right? But that
Is it just like not on the list at the back?
so yeah, not on the list at the back, and you'd sort of play the final. If you just left it in the CD player, like track 13, and you'd forget about it, you'd come back in like a couple of hours later, and there'd be like a track there playing. You're like, oh my God, I had no idea. This is another thing. And it was like, it would reward people for having it always there. And there would be like different, like the concept album and stuff like that. Smashing Pumpkins, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, like deeply pretentious, like teenage music, but like arranging the songs in a particular way with a particular aesthetic. Like, although it's, you know, it's incredible to listen to whatever music you want in whatever order, like whenever you can, you lose some of the presentation of the past. I mean, I don't want to go back to, I don't know, only having like 15 CDs. That was expensive.
Yes,
like, you couldn't have very much music.
I remember hearing an interview, I think it was with Bob Geldof, or reading an interview with the Boomtown Rats about when they're making one of their albums, and about this idea that at that point albums had started to become sort of basically a collection of very individual songs, like independent songs. And you see it with things like 2IA by Dexys Midnight Runners. Is the end of the song is very much the intro to the next song. But that art form is potentially gone now that we live in this world of like, you know, singles that are grouped together rather than it being like a performance. And, you know, it springs to mind things like performances, like live shows by people like David Bowie, which have a plot. Essentially, they're like opera, which is potentially lost in digital music.
I suspect it's just a little bit out of fashion. I genuinely believe this sort of thing will come back in. I know Jericho, for example, my comedy club, is releasing like an album.
No way!
So, yeah, and one of the reasons we're going to do it on vinyl. Which isn't like my medium. I didn't grow up with vinyl and stuff like that. One of those reasons is that the recordings are like locked into a particular order. With a CD, you can rip them off, you can spread them around and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't necessarily come with like an artwork and an aesthetic. And we just thought that I've been missing that kind of live experience so much of stand-up comedy. I really missing it in a way that I think is quite pathetic, actually. I didn't realise how much of my life was like wrapped in it. So we just want to put like one particular night. I say it should be like one particular night. Harry's like, oh, we'll just chop and change and like arrange, but it might either be one particular night, like with all the crowd work in there as well. I think one of the beautiful things of that night at the cafe is that there's such an interplay between that audience, which is, I don't know, like 1.5 meters away from the comedian. We really ran them in. And there's so much back and forth between the audience and the different comics. The night I want to do, all the comics are referring to each other's sets and things that have happened. It's such a live experience. And I think comedy's great for audio as well. Like, you really make yourself there, I think, in a way that sometimes with a lot of recorded comedy, you feel the screen, you feel the barrier, I think, more, and sort of somewhat counterintuitively, you feel more there with the visual taken away.
I think that's interesting, because sometimes when you do see clips on YouTube of like the best bits from whoever's live set, and then they'll actually refer to something that happened in the audience that you weren't there for, and that's why I guess live comedy is such an immersive experience, because it is self-referential. I think this is a conversation you and I have had before about the visuals of comedy, of live stand-up comedy, and not talking about kind of surrealist, abstract stuff, but just talking about being a stand-up comedian. And like you said, it's a very audio experience, because that's how you get the word jokes in your ears. But this idea of what does a stand-up comedian look like? And you sort of have a uniform essentially when you perform on stage, all black. And I think it might have been you, or it might have been Harry Housam, who's the other half of Jericho Comedy, was speaking about this idea of how women present themselves on stage as a visual of a stand-up comedian, because I think that being a woman in stand-up comedian is still not viewed as kind of the default of a stand-up comedian, and how you present yourself on stage is part of this performance, even if what you're wearing or how you look isn't part of the joke.
Part of my approach is to be relatively neutral. You've got sort of two schools when you're choosing, maybe three, when you're choosing what you should look like. And so you can either wear something that emphasizes part of the character that you're putting across, or you can strip back and you can, so I wear quite like, I wear a sort of a Bauhausian gothic aesthetic on stage, quite minimalist, quite, all black. And it's to remove some of the expectations of if I'm wearing a band t-shirt, if I'm wearing a shirt collar, it removes some of the expectations that you might have of me going onto stage, so that more is invested in the words.
Yeah.
Even just having things like words on your shirt, for example, like when a comedian's got words on their shirt, I'll read the words. Rather than like listening. And so I think a minimalist aesthetic is quite popular with stand-up comedians for that kind of reason. And we're also kind of mini scientists all the time, right? In a very bizarre way, right? We're performing this experiment every night where we say relatively similar words, hoping for a different outcome, a funnier outcome each time. And so if you're limiting the things other than the material that you're changing, you learn more about the material. So that's a little bit the school of thought I go for with it. And obviously, you can be a character act, or you can pick an aesthetic that kind of conveys something very quickly about how you appear. It's worth mentioning how much more difficult this is if you're a woman in comedy. I think somebody other than me can talk about it in much more detail, but women are much more quickly like judged for how they appear, whether that is too beautiful, I've heard, as a bit of feedback. I mean, it's just
I nodded like, yeah, I get that all the time, and it's an absolute nightmare for me.
You might do.
Yeah, or this idea that either, if you're a female comedian, you're either beautiful and stupid, or you are not sexually attractive, so you're probably talking about like being a lesbian. Yeah. And that's like the foundation level of it. But it's interesting talking about appearance when appearance isn't the main thing, because I suppose to a large extent that is true of both comedians, but also of musicians and of artists to a certain extent, because a lot of artists are very separate from their work, so their personal aesthetic doesn't necessarily play into what they make. And the same with music. It's incredible how important your look is in an industry about audio. So you think about like Harry Styles wearing these kind of vintage high-waisted trousers has made him so much more popular than if he was wearing jeans. And that's huge into playing about like who he is as a musician, even though a musician is someone who makes music rather than a musician is someone who wears clothes.
So, yeah, so perceptive. I watched an episode of The Voice, and I think you might be able to analyze this for me, which is like based on this premise that like you don't see the artist performing the music, right? I was like, what a great concept. You just listen and then you turn around and whoa, expectations. Every single one of the judges, when they turned around, were like, you look great. You look this. It was suddenly like the visual was so important. It's like you looked exactly how I'd imagine, or like I love the whole aesthetic. And it was like, well, what is this about? Like, is this about like the audio? Is it like really zoning in on the voice, or is it about like the whole package? I was expecting one thing. Either's fine. Like,
whatever.
Whole like units. But I thought it was interesting how hard it is to divorce art from the artist.
And there was a show that was huge during the first or second lockdown called Love is Blind, which similarly was about not looking at people. So the premise was that there was a group of girls and a group of boys, and they would sit in rooms which were joined by a wall that you couldn't see through, and they'd speak to each other. And it was an experiment about basically whether you can fall in love without having met someone, having had any like physical intimacy with them. And these couples would get, they'd talk to each other and they'd really like each other, and they would agree to get engaged after like 5 days or something.
Oh, wow.
After which, once they'd got engaged, they were allowed to see each other. And then they kind of go off on holiday. And then at the end of the season, there are the weddings where they can decide whether or not they actually get married based on that, and to see whether love is blind. And the thing is that everyone who was on that program was perfectly good looking. which didn't really prove anything. It's the same with The Voice, where you don't turn around and you go, you've got a lovely voice, but boy, oh boy, what a face. Because all of these people were all pleasantly surprised with who they got, because they were all pretty much gorgeous straight through and through. And it goes back to this thing of, like, we all remember where we were when we saw Susan Boyle's audition for X Factor, where everyone laughed at her because of her presentation. And now, obviously, when you see her singing or her album covers or whatever, it's because they've got a team of stylists being like, this is how you should look. But when she was just this like housewife from Scotland, everyone was like, she's not going to be able to sing. So it is weird how much, as humans, I suppose, we do have a very visceral reaction to how people look. And even if that's not like to do with like cleanliness, even if that's just to do with what you're wearing, we're so quick at being able to work out whether you're like a goodie or a baddie. Like the whole thing with Dracula is, when you see Dracula characters, you're never like, he's probably really nice. But that's all to do with the aesthetic of it.
And what I liked about the Gothic aesthetic, I think it probably fails in this like attempt, but is to subvert those expectations of what somebody should look like. It's a non-mainstream form of beauty. I mean, the great irony is like, oh, I want to be an individual. I'm going to become a goth and look exactly the same as every other goth that's ever been, you know, like that kind of thing. I certainly appreciate the attempt, right, to not look the kind of whatever preppy cool means in that time, and you know, like the goth aesthetic becomes fashionable or less fashionable. It goes in and out of mainstream, but its heart is an attempt to give like the nerd and the loser and the somebody who doesn't quite fit in another route, and I think that's valuable. So it's often why people like us go into comedy, right? It's a way for us to express ourselves maybe we couldn't have done anyway. I'm guessing a little bit your story there when I shouldn't necessarily, but
us complete losers finding our place.
Sure. Apologies for heavily implying that you might be a loser like me. But,
No worries. Alex, thank you so much for talking to me today. Could you let us know where the best place is to follow you, keep up with what you're doing?
My public face is Twitter. I think Alex_Farrow, or I'm on all the social medias with my face. Alex Farrow Comedy on Instagram, Facebook, MySpace, Bebo.
You can follow Alex in the ways written below. You can follow me at VerityBabsArt on Instagram, and please make sure to give us a subscribe and a like, etc. And I'll see you next time.